I have never publicly endorsed a presidential candidate, officially publicly endorsing you both to become president and vice president of our great country.
You're endorsing Trump, essentially.
I would, yeah. He should be president of the United States. That's what he
Celebrities coming out and saying, this is who we think you should vote for.
I don't think you're helping them. I don't think anybody who's any sort of intelligent person, decides who they're going to vote for because the guy who pretended to be a shogun, in some movie told you to do it. We're talking about who should lead the free world.
In this turbulent year, there was one event that the whole world eagerly watched. This was the United States elections. The fight between Biden and Trump, the split in ideologies, and a divided America led to an increased amount of social media coverage. We have spent hours and hours scrolling through the endless posts about both candidates. We've seen our favorite influencers, celebrities, and hometown friends suddenly hooked by politics and eager to share their opinions online. Welcome to our first episode of Good Influence. Here, we will analyze your favorite influencers' behaviors, the effect they have on the public, and whether their actions are correct from a legal perspective. Talking about celebrity involvement, David Dobrik was one of the influencers that has used his platform to encourage voting, as he in fact cannot. As a DACA recipient in the United States, he was not able to cast his vote in this landmark election. He did, however, want to encourage others to mark their voice and decided to create an impressive giveaway. Whoever is familiar with his content knows that this is no rarity and that he has given multiple cars to his friends and other lucky winners. This time, though, a sheer number of 120,000 people registered to vote solely through this giveaway, and another 250,000 verified their registration status. Maybe you wonder now how we know all of this information of how many people registered just because of him. Through the website headcount.org, a creator has a unique landing page that includes a form which takes the visitor's basic information and then directs them to the state's registration site. The website can then calculate how many registrations were complete, as well as how many voter actions were taken. Voter actions means, for example, checking polling place information or arranging to vote by mail. A number of other creators and celebrities have used this website to encourage voter turnout, including Billie Eilish, Taylor Swift, and Shawn Mendes. Besides these campaigns, we have seen some celebrities publicly endorse candidates, including the publicly independent Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. He made clear that he never publicly endorsed a candidate, but felt that the Biden-Harris combination was the best choice to lead the United States. Even Cardi B voiced her side as she casually chatted with Joe Biden to advocate for his campaign. To everyone's surprise, however, it was nano-influencers that might have been the most powerful asset for political campaigns this year. Political marketers described the latter as more trustworthy to their following and better to influence their behavior. Many of these influencers, though, do not reveal that they have been paid, which amounts to a new growing form of inorganic information operations and possibly a form of hidden propaganda.
For a long time, celebrities and influencers have been ridiculed for sharing their political opinion with the world. And the rationale behind this was that famous people are known for their acting, playing, singing, or modeling, and not for handling political affairs. Nevertheless, in the past couple of years, influencers have had an unprecedented impact on the political scene. I believe one of the best example of celebrities making their mark on politics is Oprah Winfrey. During the 2008 US election, Oprah openly endorsed Barack Obama on live television. And this may sound insignificant, but it was the most widely covered and studied development of the 2008 presidential campaign. Do you know why? Well, according to two economists of the University of Maryland, Winfrey's endorsement of Obama attracted him over 1 million votes in the Democratic primary and was considered a decisive factor in his election. Can you imagine? It was so far-reaching that it even carries a name, the Oprah effect, and has been the subject of various studies. There are evident reasons behind this triumph. Oprah has over 8 million daily viewers on her shows and accumulates over 60 million followers on her social media platforms, through which she was able to increase Obama's visibility within the African-American community especially. This example underlines the impact of influence and can have on the political landscape. But this phenomenon is not uncommon. Of course, few public figures hold the reputation of Winfrey, but similar endorsements have taken place over the past 4 years throughout the use of social media platform with, as we just mentioned, David Dobrik. And although influencers are increasingly endorsing political candidates, many critics are beginning to question whether this endorsement, which has a significant influence on a political election, is even allowed. Well, we have explored the issue, and here's what we found. An important distinction has to be drawn between influencer endorsing a candidate on their own initiative and influencer endorsing a candidate based on contractual relationship. As a general rule, people have the right to express their political preference. This freedom is protected under the First Amendment of the US Constitution. But what exactly is the state obligation with regards to freedom of expression? In the police department of the city of Chicago versus Moosey case, the Supreme Court elaborated on the freedom of expression and on the resulting state action requirements. It said that the First Amendment means that the government has no power to restrict expression because of its message, its ideas, its subject matter, or its content, as to permit the continued building of a politics and culture, and to assure self-fulfillment for each individual. It said that our people guaranteed the right to express any thought free from government censorship. And so any infringement with freedom of expression, such as censorship, would thus restrict personal growth and individual expansion, and would undercut the national commitment to the principle that debate on public issues should be inhibited, robust, and wide open. Now, the question is whether political speech is also covered by the First Amendment. The most resonating dissenting opinion in this regard was the one delivered by the Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. This case revolves more around campaign spending as a form of freedom of expression, but the Supreme Court mentioned something very important in its decision, namely that political speech was indeed covered by the First Amendment and that it required the highest level of scrutiny against the law that regulated. There have been several other cases involving political spending, campaign-related activities, and the court often adopts a similar approach to political speech protection and insists on the ability of the people to speak freely without the fear of government repression on the matters that relate to how this country is run, whilst criticizing and holding elected officials accountable has been the foundation of the American democratic system. Now, although the application of this political speech is not always even, it is evident from the impressive case law of the Supreme Court that this form of speech is covered under the First Amendment and is by far the most protected one. It is thus safe to say that influencers have a constitutional right to endorse a political candidate or to criticize a candidate, the government, and how the country should function. This form of speech is afforded the strongest protection, and usually any restriction of them are judged by a strict scrutiny standard. Internet speech, however, is a different story. The digital revolution has produced the most diverse and active communication medium ever, but internet speech does not benefit from the same protection than general speech. The First Amendment only limits governmental actors from an infringement or interference with the freedom of expression, as this is the case for most constitutional rights. In its case law, the US Supreme Court has developed what is called the State Action Doctrine, which stipulates that the US Constitution and its individual rights apply only to the state action and not private actors. As a result, private actors are not constrained by the Constitution, even though these private entities, and in particular social media networking platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, can limit and censor speech as much as governmental entity. In 2020, however, speech takes place online as much as, if not more than it does in traditional public spaces. So as communication on social networking sites increases, shouldn't network platforms also be bound by the First Amendment? Well, in the Packingham versus North Carolina case, the Supreme Court has recognized that cyberspaces or forms of the internet were indeed the places where exchanges of view occurred the most, but have not done much about it. Justice Kennedy added in his opinion that social media networking sites have become the modern day equivalent of traditional public forums like public park, like public street, and such a radical change in communication requires state action doctrine to be modified, and that it is time to recognize the reach of the First Amendment has expanded. Although some state Supreme Courts interpret free expression provision in state constitution to provide protection to individuals involving private actors, as a general rule, the First Amendment only protects individuals against the government. Social media platforms are private sectors entities, and therefore they have no First Amendment obligation to protect freedom of speech. So you have no constitutional free speech right to share your views on any social media platform. It is basically up to the platform to promulgate rules and to decide what content can or cannot be published. Your freedom of speech pretty much depends on the community standards. For example, Facebook's speech code and policy. It is thus possible for influencers to express their political opinion and to endorse a candidate as long as it is within the community standards of the social network. Deliberately endorsing a candidate and being paid to endorse a candidate, however, are two very distinct things. In the first one, it is a personal political activism. The influencer decides to post politically charged content because they personally want to spread a message, inspire an audience, or to make a difference in society. Sometimes even audience expect these influencers to speak about certain issue to which the influencer responds. The situation is different when an influencer is being paid to endorse a candidate, and it leads to two main issues. First, the political mobilization of these influencers, usually nano-influencer, as we will discuss it later, And the lack of disclosure regarding the payment or affiliation makes it particularly difficult to determine whether they are expressing their genuine standpoint or whether they're exploiting an intimate relationship with their audience. At first sight, you would think that these influencers are expressing their political views, which, as I have said above, are constitutional rights. But in fact, they are using manipulation techniques and exercising a form of propaganda. So how does the audience distinguish a personally motivated political activism from an influencer who is being paid by campaigns to spread partisan content if no endorsement contract is disclosed? The second issue that arises is one of transparency. Transparency, especially with regards to the advertisement, has never been an asset of social networks. There is often not sufficient enforcement of influencers when they post advertisement, and if they do disclose these paid partnerships, it is most of the time very ambiguous. It is all the more complicated when it comes to paid political advertisement by nano-influencer. Although social networks such as Facebook and Instagram have imposed stricter requirements for political advertisement, these nano-influencers often avoid political advertisement policies because of their small scale and because their behavior and content is not distinguishable from regular people who are involved in political speech. Moreover, political advertising content does not qualify for the strict and more commercially oriented rules imposed by Facebook or Instagram, which is poorly enforced, if not at all, which makes it even more difficult to trace the origin of these payments and subsequently to identify the actors who are potentially trying to coerce voters with the voice of influencers. Are they political groups, foreign groups seeking to distort the public opinion? Without proper standards of disclosure, differentiating genuine political speech and political campaigns will continue to be difficult and will remain a concern for digital transparency, accountability, and potentially national security. The 2020 presidential campaign is probably the best illustration of this modern culture of partisan influences. Although this trend is not new, the tactic of paying micro-influencers to spread political messages or make content has reached a new height during the 2020 race. According to the news agency Reuters, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee and Progressive Political Action Committee, Next Gen America, have approached several agencies to connect influencers with brands and have recruited and paid hundreds of influencers to encourage people to vote. Former presidential candidate Michael Bloomberg, for instance, has even sent notification people through his influencer marketplace Tribe to invite them to make content and to support him on social media. But why do these candidates hire small-scale influencers to reach an audience? And who are those nano-influencers? Micro or nano-influencers are those individuals with somewhere between 10,000 and 50,000 followers, sometimes even more, on social media services such as Instagram, Twitter, and even TikTok. They are normal people who often have jobs alongside their social media careers and who are engaged at the different levels of the community. But most important, nano-influencers have a significant higher engagement with their followers than other influencers. They share specific and personal information with their audience and often take time to interact with them through comments or live videos, which allows them to build a closer and more personal relationship and acquire a higher degree of trust. Nano-influencers are trustworthy and are seen as relatable compared to other celebrities. This is why these nano-influencers are such an important political tool and why seeking them to make political content allows a campaign to reach a part of the population which they never could have.
Everyone I followed was advocating for Biden.
I think I saw a lot of small figures, small scale influencers supporting or having like political oriented content, and usually Democratic candidates as well. Maybe that's also because my feed is more democratically oriented, I guess, because I haven't seen any conservative endorsement.
That's often the problem, that you're kind of in your own social media bubble and that you basically follow those people who kind of align with your political views. Because I also had the same problem. I mean, I saw a lot of posts by especially actors and some musicians who I mostly follow on Twitter or something, and they all basically endorsed some already during the Democratic primaries. They had like their special candidates. I mean, I follow a lot of the West Wing actors, so of course they're kind of into the political sphere, and they all had their personal political candidate. For example, lots of them had Pete Buttigieg, and then it kind of evolved to Joe Biden when Pete Buttigieg also withdrew and endorsed Joe Biden. So I also haven't seen really any conservative voices. Basically, I know there are a few actors, or more of has-been actors probably, who endorsed Donald Trump kind of loudly and who are also retweeted by Trump and everything, but really mostly Democrats.
Yeah, I think so. I remember a few Republican figures. I think Clint Eastwood.
Oh yeah.
A couple of years ago.
Clint Eastwood and John Voight, the father of Angelina Jolie, and I don't know if you know him, Kelsey Grammer, who played Frasier and in Cheers in the old sitcoms.
Lil, what's his name?
Lil Pump. But
Lil Pump, yeah.
That's actually super interesting because he like publicly advocated for Trump, but it was found that he never actually voted. So he was not registered to vote. He didn't vote for Trump, but still he went out on that stage and told everyone to do so. So it's like interesting to see like, why did he do it? What was his motivation if he didn't even go himself, you know?
The insight behind it.
Yeah. It's kind of like the sheep thing. Like you see what everyone else is doing, and because we have more pro-democratic content, I feel like we follow kind of this idea of like, okay, this is right, like this is good,
And
but then the other side has the same, you know?
Yeah, we're only exposed to this democratic, liberal content and not to anything else.
I also think that's really problematic because when I've done the research for this episode, I also looked at some of the TikTok Republican hype houses and looked through their short clips for basically 2 hours, and it's really easy to get influenced by such content because it's kind of striking. They have like short clips and they have like 3 facts, and of course they don't ask questions whether these facts are valid. And I mean, but of course the Democrat opponents would do the same in their TikTok videos. So it's not really deep information, but it's really just striking infos, 1 or 2 points. And it's really easy to get influenced by this, especially if you really just follow one side, I would say. So, I mean, of course, I'm also quite heavily Democrat leaning. And of course, we all basically rather follow the Democrat ideals. But I still think if we watched conservative feeds and influencers, and if we had followed them for the last 3 years and didn't have like heavily Democrat leaning Twitter bubbles, Instagram bubbles, I think our views would have changed at least a little bit.
Yeah, and definitely I think it's also like very important to see that a lot of people who grow up in a household that's pro-conservative, Republican in any kind of direction, it's quite hard to like get out of those views if everyone around you, just environment or on social media, is advocating for a certain thing. I feel like subconsciously you're kind of directed into this, I don't know, this mindset. And also it's like important to see that there's Republican and then there's pro-Trump. Like, I feel like it's such a huge difference, but like for me, looking at that content, I'm like, okay, that is super bad, like Republican, nah. But it's basically just Trump's ideals and his extremism that we're like against, not just conservative ideas, I would say.
So do you think that because the reach influencers can have on politics in general, do you think they should be allowed to express their political opinion or endorse a candidate on social media platforms?
I think they should be, but I still have the feeling that it should be kind of more regulated. I think they should be free to express their opinions, but should be more regulated. But I think I will talk a little bit more about this in my part later in this episode. But I think there are a lot of arguments to be made for kind of giving them a framework in which they can offer their free expression or opinion also.
So more regulation and maybe more transparency. Yeah.
I think everyone is affected by it, but especially young people are so involved and engaged in social media that it's kind of become their like second reality. And I think it just needs to be regulated to protect those certain groups that might be very influenceable.
Manipulable, yeah.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it's also kind of difficult if you have like a regulatory framework, or if you want to enact one, to basically really distinguish between micro influencers and just private persons. I mean, if we say micro influencers have like between 1 and 10,000 followers, so where do you really draw the line? I mean, there are a lot of basically high school kids who have like 1,000 followers, and if they just post something pro Biden, pro Trump, pro anything, and then you say, oh yeah, is she really an influencer because she already has like 1,000 followers, even if these might really just be here through friends or bigger friendship area.
Exactly. Where do you put the limit on small-scale influencer to bigger influencer celebrities? But also, I think that would have a huge impact on the personality itself, because we would consider that influencers are only influencers and they are only on social media to promote certain things that would distinguish the citizens and being allowed to vote and having freedom of expression. So that would also distort this idea we have of influencers. I'm not sure it's a good idea.
Yeah, we'll go further into this with Florian, I think.
Let's jump right into it.
I'm going to talk here about the federal election campaign laws, which might be a little bit specific now, but it's basically the US framework for election content, election ads, basically everything that has to do with the federal election. Maybe we have to remind ourselves, even if you, Delia, and Lucas already talked a little bit about it, why is this becoming increasingly important? For example, in the presidential election in 2008 between Barack Obama and John McCain, both candidates spent in total $22.25 million on online advertising. You might think that's quite a lot already, but it's just staggering if you see development until the election in this year between Trump and Biden, where both candidates spent in total $1.4 billion on online advertisement. So we've seen this just a staggering increasement here. And the problem is generally that the regulations that apply today for online advertising, influencer advertising for federal election campaigns are still over a decade old. So basically, if you think about how our current status has been 10 years ago, it just has changed so drastically when it comes to social media. I mean, 10 years ago, Instagram wasn't that big of a thing. TikTok didn't even exist at this point, but still we have the same regulations. So you might already see that's quite problematic. And another problem is that policing the crossover between the election campaigns and influencer campaigns largely falls to the social media outlets. So it's still kind of difficult to basically regulate and monitor content on social media outlets. First, let's look at the difference between traditional media outlets such as newspapers, radio stations, TV stations, and social media platforms under the federal election campaign regulations, because this is also to some extent the core of the problem. Because, for example, if you look at traditional media outlets such as newspapers, they are considered publishers under US law, and therefore a lot of regulations apply to them and are under a lot of requirements when it comes to elections. For example, they have to offer, if we talk about a TV station, the TV station has to offer some advertising slots to every candidate for a federal election campaign. So, for example, even if you have some really heavily conservative media outlet, it couldn't just say, no, we don't want to offer Joe Biden a place for his TV ad before a federal election campaign because we are clearly pro-Trump, so we don't want to see this content here. So they are really under an obligation to air every ad they receive to some extent, of course. And generally, they basically have to provide access for the political candidates to the electorate, which to some extent, of course, makes some sense because this way the media circle is not heavily biased. Social media, on the other hand, as it's still a private company, is under no obligation to run every political ad they receive. So, for example, Twitter could really validly say, no, we don't like Trump, we're under a feud with Trump at the moment, so we basically block every Trump-related post. They're private companies, they can set their own policies, as Lucas already mentioned, and they don't have to comply with the First Amendment, and they are seen as internet service providers. Therefore, they are not liable for what other people, so the users, post on them based on Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which you might have heard a lot about in the last 2 weeks, again, because it's under heavy attack by Donald Trump, who also threatened to veto the defense bill if this exact act is not repealed. It can, of course, be debated whether this really would just have negative consequences if this would be repealed, or if there would also be some positive aspect. But if this would really be repealed, this would lead to some heavy changes in the US landscape when it comes to social media. Another problem is that there's a discrepancy who basically is responsible for regulating political ads or endorsement by influencers, by actors, by musicians, because there's a discrepancy between the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, and the Federal Election Commission. The FTC is basically responsible for all online content or ads by influencers on social media platforms. The FTC also said that it requires advertisers to ensure that the social media influencers clearly disclose when they have been compensated in exchange for their endorsement. So basically, as we also know it from most jurisdictions already in Europe that if I get paid by a fashion brand, for example, and I post something on Instagram, that I have to say, yeah, this is an ad, or I received some clothing from this brand to make this post, which was actually part of a settlement between the FTC and Lord & Taylor, a fashion brand, last year, after which the FTC commissioner also said that disclosure of ads is really vital for the democratic process and also for basically internet security and stability. The problem is that the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, is responsible for all political campaigns in federal elections. So we see there's kind of the discrepancy that the FTC is responsible for the online content by influencers and the FEC is responsible for political ads. But here we have kind of emerging system where the political ads on online social media platforms are really, political in their essence. Therefore, it's not really clear who should be responsible for these. At the moment, the FTC, therefore, the current rules for social media companies do not require influencer disclosures because the FEC doesn't really have an influence on regulating online ads by political influencers. However, the chair of the FEC actually wants to ban targeted political ads because he thinks that there's a potential to direct misinformation to susceptible groups with little accountability. Of course, there's a lot of talk also in the US, in the Senate, in the House of Representatives at the moment, how to basically change that. Last year, there was actually a bipartisan bill introduced in the Senate by Amy Klobuchar, also with the late John McCain in collaboration, and it's called the Honest Ads Act, and it had some basic ideas on how to change the current system. For example, the equal time rule, as I've already mentioned it, which applies for outlets such as TV stations, radio stations. Is it feasible that this should also apply to social media companies? You would basically say, Facebook should look out for that it basically gives enough ad spaces for Donald Trump if it gives the same amount to Joe Biden. Or even one step further, a Republican senator also argued that there should be completely political neutral content moderation on all social media websites. Do you think that those proposals are feasible? Do you think it's necessary to enact some measures like these, or do you think the current system should be fine as we've seen it in this election cycle in the US?
Really difficult question. It needs regulation, but maybe not to that extent. It should stay neutral, but imposing too much regulation would go against it. We need to strike a balance here.
Florian, as the expert on the topic, what's your opinion on it?
So first of all, I think that to reach a level where you say, we have on a social media outlet completely political neutral content moderation, this will not be possible. The environment is just too toxic to really see that we have like a 50-50 content moderation. It's really difficult to reach that. So I think this is just not practical. I mean, you can already see that in the debate. I don't know if you've seen it, but for example, Fox News had a graphic where they showed, in the first 2 weeks after the election, Twitter flagged 100 tweets by Donald Trump with a warning and 0 by Joe Biden. So you think, oh wow, that's really heavily biased. But I've read a lot of opinions on it, and I think quite suitable picture there was, for example, it's the same as comparing, for example, an NHL ice hockey player and his penalty minute with actor George Clooney. You can't just say, Wayne Gretzky had like 2,000 somewhat penalty minutes in the NHL and George Clooney had none. So is it then that the NHL is just biased against George Clooney, or is it really that it's completely a different thing? I think it's kind of difficult in the current environment to reach a political neutral content moderation. However, for the equal time rule, I think it would at least be feasible to require those websites to basically offer advertising slots to all political candidates as it's required from TV stations or newspapers. But of course, there's legally just a problem, as Lucas already elaborated upon, that the social media companies, they don't fall under the First Amendment, so under the obligation to provide freedom of speech. And then I think it's kind of difficult to impose such obligations on private companies.
I think imposing such obligation on private entities is one issue, but also having complete content moderation on social medias would also run against their own purpose, like their own function. And if we have complete moderation, then we control basically everything that is said. And so what's the point of having such platforms?
If you think about about the election in 2016 after Trump won, there were a lot of people who were arguing that Twitter and Facebook were partially responsible for this because they didn't really prevent the spread of misinformation and everything. And now Twitter really included this policy where they basically said, yeah, we're going to warn about misinformation and about not basically substantiated claim. Now they're really trying to monitor everything. That it's not just that they really just flagged Republicans. Also, there was, for example, a Democratic candidate for, I think it was the Senate, who already claimed on Twitter, yeah, I won the state. And there also Twitter said no official sources have not yet called this race. So I think it's actually a good sign that measures are taken already, because this might show that there is a possibility to kind of bring the whole debate in the right direction without completely stifling freedom of speech. I mean, still, even the Trump claims who were kind of outrageous at some points, even those you could still see on Twitter after clicking on the warning, or directly just with seeing, yeah, might be false. I think it's actually kind of a good development.
It's probably a reaction to the 2016 election, and it's really interesting how they content from the social platforms, basically. But Twitter has really notified that this content is misleading. It's not, we don't know whether it's true or false yet. So they don't want to remove the content, but they want to inform users that it might not be true, which I think is a better approach to. I think also a very important extent. This misinformation is also our individual duty to figure out what is true, what is not. And so maybe we should educate people by other means than through platforms. It's not their duty to inform us whether it's true or not.
I think it could be nice if, for example, social media platforms had like a coherency of approach. Because you just mentioned the difference between Twitter and Facebook and how they handled this. I think it would be very beneficial to have. Thank you for joining us today on this journey through the Good Influence episode. We hope to see you soon.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.